So there's still about 12 to 13 minutes before lecture starts. So if you're watching this video, feel free to skip ahead about 12 minutes. Morning.
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 All right, less than 2 minutes left. Just do the usual reminders since it's not quite 8 yet. Just say the same stuff I always say. Don't forget to do independent work. You have until the last day of class to do 100 points worth of written work. If you haven't started, I would recommend it. And remember, there's no minimum or maximum regarding the length of your papers. You can send in really short papers or really long papers, whatever you want. What are some other reminders, things I've been saying? Don't forget that I'm here to help you, right? So if you're doing a lab or writing an independent work paper, let me know if you need to meet online. I'll be happy to help you with anything. I'll also remind you that you can still retake the first exam. All you have to do is email me and make a request. And still, hardly anyone's taking me up on that offer. I don't understand why. If you get a lower grade, then you just go around. If you get a lower grade, we'll just stick with your higher grade. And the retake, you can retake it as many times as you want. It's open book. It's not timed, so I don't understand why no one's taking me up on that offer. But you definitely don't have to. The offer is there. Just let me know. What are some other reminders? Not quite 8 yet. What else? Lab. Make sure this week. This is an important lab, right? Because we're doing you have to do a lab report on this week's lab. So make sure you're on time. I will be locking the doors at 10:01. So again, make sure you're on time. And it's close to now. It's 8. So let's do attendance. Obviously, if you're online, you don't have to say anything when I call your name because you're just physically not here. So as always, you'll just send me the words. Bangura, not here. Casebolt, not here. Tristan, not here. Jeremiah, there is here. Yay. DeVere is not here. Dow is not here. Hughes is not here. Lebdi is not here. Little is not here. Mankins is not here. Mathis is not here. Rains is here. Reed is not here. Elise is not here. Thompson is not here. Withrow is not here. Yundui is not here. Elkins is here. So let's get started. Hope you guys had a good weekend. I hate the way we had to stop in the middle of talking about light reactions because, now it's been a whole weekend, so it might not be fresh in your mind. But this is the last thing we talked about. Actually, before we get started, attendance is going to be the same way it usually is. It has been recently, right? So I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm going to say Your next word for attendance is, and it'll be an answer to a question that I'm about to ask. And then again, at the end, I'm going to ask you to send me one question about all the stuff I covered today. So, business as usual. Anyway, this is the last thing we talked about. I guess big picture, I'll at least repeat myself in the big stuff here. The point here is, in the light reactions, if you don't remember anything else, remember this is the purpose of the light reactions, is to make ATP and to get these high energy electrons, right? Because the Calvin cycle, which is what we're going to talk about very soon, the Calvin cycle is what actually makes the glucose. And remember, that's the whole purpose of photosynthesis, is to make glucose, right? So it's the second stage that does that. This stage, the purpose of it is to have energy, right? Because it's going to take energy to squish all those carbon atoms together. But also we need some high energy electrons to incorporate into that molecule. And that's what we're getting from the light reactions. And the last thing we talked about was this, when we talked about how specifically the light reactions make ATP. And like I said last week, as far as we're concerned, it's basically the same as cellular respiration. Except what we have here, again, we have these high energy electrons. They go from protein to protein, right? And in the process of going to protein, they're releasing their energy. That energy is used to pump hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient. And then those hydrogen ions then just diffuse back down the concentration gradient, going through this enzyme called ATP synthase. And then the process of doing that, we produce ATP. So it's very similar, right? The only difference here, well, the main differences here for us are that we're dealing with water is giving us the electrons instead of glucose, right? And then the process of doing that, it also produces some oxygen. So your first word for attendance. When water gives up the electrons for this, what does it produce? What molecule does it produce? So yes, it's giving up electrons, but in the process, it produces blank. So not only would you be required to be paying attention to what I said, but actually you should know that anyway. So I've said it a lot. This is the first time I said it today. So any questions about this slide? Again, as far as we're concerned, especially when it comes to the exam, photosynthesis, when it comes to making the ATP, it's just the same as respiration. There are obvious differences, but as far as the exam is concerned, we're not going to get into it. Again, right, here's what respiration looks like. Remember this from last chapter, right? The high energy electrons go from protein to protein. In the process of doing that, they're releasing their energy. That released energy is used to pump hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient. Then they diffuse back down the concentration gradient through that enzyme, ATP synthase, and that's where we're making the most ATP. Right? So again, as far as we are concerned, it's nearly identical. So any questions about light reactions? That's it for light reactions. And again, my suggestion on how to study this is to memorize the big stuff before you start adding details. So when you go back to study all this, when you're studying the light reactions, the first thing you need to memorize is the fact that we're producing ATP and high energy electrons, right, in ADPH. Once you have that memorized, then start adding those details, like how exactly do we produce those high energy electrons? And how exactly do we produce that ATP? But if you forget all of that, again, please remember that it's the light reactions that produce ATP and high energy electrons. And in my opinion, the easiest way to remember that is, well, just think about light. It's in the name, right? Light reactions, and you know light is a form of energy. So you should think of that as the thing that's producing energy. Notice I said produce, not create, right? We can't create or destroy energy, but we're producing energy in the light reactions. Because the thing we're about to talk about now needs energy, right? That's the Calvin cycle is the thing that's like the factory, right? It's the thing that's making what we're after, which is the glucose. So yeah, you can think of it as a sugar factory almost, right? The Calvin cycle is like a sugar factory. It's taking the energy that it got from the light reactions and squishing a bunch of carbon atoms together to make different types of sugar. As far as we're concerned, it's going to be glucose, but in all actuality, there are different things. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. It also regenerates its starting material with each turn. That'll make a lot more sense when I show you a picture of it. You're not going to need to know the name of it, even though the picture I'm about to show you from the old textbook does have the name of that starting material. But as far as we're concerned, that doesn't matter either. This is more like that second bullet point is kind of explaining, all right, this is why it's called a cycle, right? Because we start with something, we readjust it, we do some things to it, and then by the end, we're back where we started, and that's what makes it a cycle. Obviously, just like in the respiration, when we talked about the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, there are inputs and outputs, right? And this is no different in that regard. Now, what the inputs and outputs are different, right? So in this case, in the Calvin cycle, the inputs are the carbon dioxide that we get from the air, ATP that we got from the light reactions, and the NADPH that we got from the light reactions, right? That's our input. And the output, or the sugar, and that's what we're after. And you can see here, technically it's called G3P. Technically that's the sugar we're making. But later, that G3P will be used to make other stuff, specifically, and this is the word you need to know, it's gonna make glucose, right? So for the exam, to keep things simple, we're just gonna say glucose. But in all actuality, again, just so you know, it's actually producing something called G3P. Not that you need to know that, but yeah, and then that G3P will be used to make other stuff, which is a good independent work topic. So here I'm telling you the G3P is used to make glucose, which is important, and then other organic compounds. So you can look that up for independent work. What other organic compounds? Not that you need to know, but you can look it up for independent work. Any questions about this slide before I show you a picture of everything that's, all the words that are on the slide? All right. Here's a picture. This picture is not from your textbook. This is from the old textbook. I think the old textbook has better pictures, so I kept it. So here you can see the starting molecule, the RUBP sugar. Look, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbon molecules and 2 phosphates. That's what we start with. But here's something weird, and this is what I don't like about the old textbook. If you're paying attention to this picture, hopefully that's confusing to you. Just look at that picture. What I'm saying, what this picture is saying is, here's what we start with, and then we add a carbon molecule to it, another carbon from CO2, and we end up with this. Does anybody see the problem with this picture? We'll do some math then.
Being less than you put in.
Yeah, right? Isn't that weird? Because if you're paying attention, that thing has 5 carbons, plus that thing has 1 carbon. I'm no math major, but 5 plus 1 equals 6. Not 3. So anyway, not that you're going to need to know this for the exam, but just so you know, what's happening here is this picture is really oversimplifying things. What's actually happening is this carbon is added to this RUBP sugar, this 5 carbon molecule. Then we end up with a different 6 carbon molecule that's not even shown on this picture. And then that 6 carbon molecule is broken in half, which gives us 2 of those. So again, not that you need to know that, but that's what's happening. So there's actually 2 of these 3 carbon molecules, and only 1 of them is being shown. Then there's some more chemical reactions that are happening to it. We use that ATP that we got from the light reactions. We use those high energy electrons that we got from the light reactions, and that changes this 3 carbon molecule into a G3P sugar. Not that we're going to get that much detail. As far as the exam is concerned, though, there are 2 questions, or 3 test questions here. Which of the 2 stages uses carbon dioxide? Calvin cycle, right? Which of the 2 stages uses ATP? Calvin cycle. Which of the 2 stages uses NADPH? Calvin cycle. Which of the 2 stages produces glucose? And again, that G3P sugar will be used to produce glucose. That's the Calvin cycle. But anyway, don't need to know all these details. The old book always likes to show this. It doesn't just say, hey, we used ATP and we used NADPH. They also show the byproduct of that, right? So if you use ATP, obviously you end up with ADP. And if you use NADPH, obviously you end up with an ADP plus. But we're not going to get that detailed on the exam. Anyway, at this point in the Calvin cycle, like I said, up here towards the top, we actually have 2 of these 3 carbon molecules, even though they're only showing 1. So that means down here we actually have 2 of these G3P sugars, even though they're only showing 1. So then on the next part of the cycle, 1 of those G3P sugars goes off to make other stuff, like glucose, which is what we're after, right? And then the other one just remains in the cycle. You can see here, again, 1 left, and then this one over here stayed in the cycle. Some more things happen. Whoops. We use more ATP to change that G3P sugar
and obviously some other carbons, right? Because you can't go from 3 to 5 without having some other carbons. This picture is really horrible. Anyway, we use energy to change this G3P sugar to this RUBP sugar, and then the cycle continues. And again, we're not going to get that much detail for the exam. For the exam, you just need to know that the Calvin cycle uses carbon dioxide and ATP and high energy electrons to produce G3P sugar, or excuse me, to produce glucose. Any questions about this slide? All right, so for the next, not yet. We'll get there. All right, there's no pictures about this slide. This next slide is just a reminder, a big picture reminder. So here's the whole thing, right? So this is one chloroplast we see right here. On the left-hand side, you can see the light reactions where the light hits the photosystems that are embedded in the thylakoid membranes. Water is giving up those electrons for this process, and in the process of doing that, we produce oxygen, right? The light reactions use the light energy to produce ATP and high energy electrons, right? And then those things go into the Calvin cycle, which uses the energy from the ATP and the high energy electrons, along with carbon dioxide to make sugar. And as far as the exam is concerned, that sugar is called glucose. But you know, in all actuality, it's G3P, which is then used to make glucose and other stuff. So any questions about this slide? All right. Well, here we go. I guess the next word for attendance is, first of all, you should just know this at this point anyway, and it's on the board. Which of the two stages of photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide? Light reactions or Calvin cycle? Which one uses carbon dioxide? And again, that's not trivial. That is something you'll need to know for the exam anyway. Any questions about this slide before we do a quick review over this whole process? All right, and the other thing I want to remind you, and I mentioned this before, but it was last week, so I want to say it again. When you get to the exam and you start answering questions about photosynthesis, and remember, I told you most of the questions are going to be, in which stages does this happen, or which stage does this happen, and which stage is this used, and which stage is that produced, right? So that's how most of the questions are going to go. So remember, for photosynthesis, there's only two good options. It's either light reactions or Calvin cycle. The rest of them are there to throw you off. So as long as you answer light reactions or Calvin cycles, you'll at least get partial credit. If you guess anything else when you're answering a question about photosynthesis, you're going to get 0 points. So don't choose, if the question's about photosynthesis, you don't want to choose glycolysis, for example, right? Because that's respiration. You don't want to choose mitosis, because that will be an option. And mitosis is the stuff we're going to learn about in the next chapter. All right, so any questions? All right, so really quickly, again, the review, let's just look at some test questions. Which of the two stages uses water? Light reactions. Which of the two stages produces oxygen? Light reactions. Which of the two stages produces ATP? Light reactions. Which of the two stages produces high energy electrons in the form of NADPH? Light reactions. Which of the two stages uses those high energy electrons? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages uses ATP? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages produces glucose? Calvin cycle. And which of the two stages uses carbon dioxide? Calvin cycle. A lot of test questions there. Or and then another test question is, then this is how the test question is going to go. It's going to be like a blank. It's going to be a sentence where you fill in 3 blanks. And I don't remember verbatim how it goes, but the 3 blanks that you're going to have to fill in are going to be water, oxygen, and glucose. And the sentence is something like, in the process of photosynthesis, blank, so water, gives up electrons, producing, in the process, produces blank, oxygen. And those electrons are then eventually incorporated into a molecule of what? And the answer is glucose. So there will be a test question where there's 3 fill in the blanks. And might as well bring this up too, since we're talking about it. You'll also have a test question like that about respiration as opposed to photosynthesis. And that'll be a little bit different. And then it'll say something like, in respiration, high energy electrons come from glucose, that'll be the blank, glucose, And they are eventually accepted by a molecule of blank, oxygen, and then the process of doing that produces a molecule of blank, water. So like I said last week, you should associate those three things together: water, oxygen, and glucose. Now the process, of whether depending on what they're talking about, photosynthesis or respiration, that'll dictate in which order you're talking about them, but either way, those three things you should associate together. Any questions about that picture? All right, so once again, this is just a review. This is how the photosystems work, right? So we have these electrons that were donated by the water, which produced oxygen. Those are just regular old electrons. But they get excited, right, because these photons are hitting the chlorophyll, right? So those, and remember, there's a lot of stuff that I mentioned earlier that it's not even up here anymore because you don't need to know those details. Anyway, the electrons from the chlorophyll get excited where they are taken, right? They're taken in their high energy state. And from there, they go to the electron transport chain, right? So they go from protein to protein, releasing that energy. And that energy is used to pump hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient, which then diffuse back down the concentration gradient, and that's what produces ATP. Then you get here, and they are not as high, right? They're lower energy here than they are here, but they aren't as low as where they started, right? So they lose some of that energy. Photons excite them again. They get excited. They get captured in their excited state, and that's where we have our high energy electrons that are eventually then taken to light reactions. Calvin cycle. Now remember, you do need to kind of know that process a little bit, but I'm not going to ask what happens during the first photosystem and what happens during the second photosystem. That's on you. All right, excuse me. That's not how detailed I'm going to be on the exam. Someone sent me a question last week. It said something. I think it was like, man, I wish I remembered something about like does it produce any kind of like temporary things? Like, can they do the Calvin cycle in the dark? I think was the question. And the answer is yes. Not that you need to know that for the exam, but you can look into that for independent work if you want. Some plants, especially like desert plants, which are really hot, they only do the light reactions during the day, right? So they just build up all this ATP and build up all this NADPH. But they don't do the Calvin cycle during the day because to do that, they have to open their stomata, right, to let in the carbon dioxide. But if they let in carbon dioxide, they're also letting out their water. And it's, again, if it's the desert, they want to conserve their water. So some plants do light reactions, which you see here during the day, and then they do the Calvin cycle at night. And again, you can look that up for independent work, but you don't need to know it for the exam. Again, for a review, here, this is the second stage of photosynthesis. This is the Calvin cycle. This is where we're using carbon dioxide, right? We're using the energy of ATP to squish a bunch of carbons together, right? And incorporate some high energy electrons that we got from the light reactions to make glucose. And another thing for independent work, this is actually a really, really complicated cycle, but not the way I'm teaching it, not the way the textbook teaches it. So if you want to, you can look up Calvin cycle and tell me about it for independent work. There's a lot of in-between steps. There's a lot of molecules where we go from CO2 to this molecule, to this molecule, to this molecule. There's a lot of different in-between molecules that aren't shown there. And like we mentioned earlier, every single chemical reaction that's not shown here has its own enzyme, right? So not only do we have all these different molecules that aren't shown, but then we also have these different enzymes that let this happen. Let's see. So again, that's it for the exam. As far as the exam is concerned, exam 2, we are now done talking about everything that's going to be on exam 2. We talked on one chapter about energy, right? So we learned about enzymes and how they lower activation energy. Then we talked about respiration, which was all about getting glucose and breaking it down to release the energy. Then we asked ourselves, okay, well, where did the energy from glucose come from? Where did the glucose come from? And that's what we talked about here. So another test question you're going to have, and I'm telling you the answer right now, is like exam 2 is basically about which of the properties of life. And actually, what do you think it is? So think about all the properties of life you learned about. What have we talked about, basically? You will need to know this. Energy, right? It's all about energy. That's one of the properties of life, right? So life has to process energy. Well, here we go. That's it. That is the answer to that question. So the next and last word for attendance, we're going to have an early day today. The last word for attendance is, exam 2 is about which of the properties of life. And that's it for attendance words. That's it for today's lecture. Don't forget to get those words into me before 9. That's it. And don't forget to send a sentence too. Yeah, sorry. The last attendance word, if you will, would be you asking me a question about this material. That's it. You guys have a good week.
Dr. V. Oh, he out of there.